During our first two studies on Gog and Magog, as revealed in Ezekiel chapter 39 and Revelation chapter 20, we learned that Gog and Magog are identified with the loosing of Satan, who works through ministers of the church to deceive the congregations. However, during this study, we're going to discover that the weapons of Gog and Magog are burned for a period of 7 years to demonstrate that Satan is no longer able to deceive God's elect after they experience the first resurrection during the Feast of Tabernacles season. We begin in Revelation chapter 20 verse 7. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. Then in verse 9, we read about the destruction of Gog. And they went up on the breadth of the earth, and compassed the camp of the saints about, and the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. As we consider the broader context of Revelation chapter 20, we know that it concerns the fact that God's judgment comes upon those who worshipped the beast and his image. The image being works gospels that lead to the second death, that is hell. But on the other hand, God refers to his elect as the rest of the dead who were killed because they reject the works gospels taught in the church. But wonderfully, God promised that they would experience the first resurrection, that is salvation, after Satan, Gog and Magog are destroyed. The victory over Gog and the salvation of God's elect is further delineated in Ezekiel chapter 39, where we learn that the weapons of Gog and her emissaries Meshech and Tubal were burned for 7 years. In verse 9 of Ezekiel chapter 39 we read, And they that dwell in the cities of Israel shall go forth, and shall set on fire and burn the weapons, both the shields and the bucklers, and the bows and the arrows, and the handstaves and the spears. They shall burn them with fire 7 years. Now in our previous study, we learned from Ezekiel chapter 32 that Meshech and Tubal, surrogates of Gog, that is Satan, used their weapons to condemn the unsaved to hell. And as a result, the land became filled with graves. And we know that the word grave refers to hell. In other words, Revelation chapter 20 revealed that if we continue to worship Satan through the false doctrines of the church, we will become subject to the second death, which is hell. However, when God brings us out of the church, it is though many weapons of Meshech and Tubal are being burned. In this respect, when we read that the bows and the arrows in Ezekiel chapter 39 verse 9 are burned, we know that these weapons represent the counsel of the wicked, according to Psalm 64 verse 3 and Ephesians 6:16. But wonderfully, Luke 11:22 affirms that God spoiled Satan's house and armor so that we can no longer be deceived by his devices, i.e., fiery darts. But why are these weapons burned for 7 years? Well, according to Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 10, the 7 years point to the Feast of Tabernacles, during which time God destroyed all the heathen kings of the land, Sihon and Og, representatives of Satan, and commanded Israel to turn away from idols and to keep his covenant. A similar predicament is found in Zechariah chapter 14, where God destroyed Israel's enemies during the Feast of Tabernacles and withheld rain, which represents doctrine that turns us away from the errors of Satan's ministers. Finally, Ezekiel chapter 45 records that after Gog and Magog were destroyed, faithful priests like Zadok, who represents faithful teachers, kept the Feast of Tabernacles by dividing the lots or inheritance, which spiritually guarantees that God's elect will become saved, that is, experience the first resurrection. And that resurrection leads to our next study, when we will examine the 7 months of burials, also spoken of in Ezekiel chapter 39.